Welcome. We're going to be taking a very detailed look today at a case that has truly come to define a generation of concerns about youth violence in the United Kingdom.
It's a case that many people will remember.
The tragic killing of 10-year-old Damilola Taylor. The source material we have for this is, as you can imagine, incredibly sensitive.
It is. It spans the horrific details of the crime itself, but also the torturous and complex legal processes that followed.
And then, ultimately, the powerful social legacy that was forged from such an immense amount of grief. We are, of course, approaching this subject with the profound respect it deserves.
Absolutely. And when we do an exploration like this, the goal isn't just to revisit the headlines.
No.
Our mission is to really analyze the documentation, the reports, the legal summaries, to give you a thorough understanding of the whole journey.
We're going to trace the life of Damilola, look at the circumstances of his death in November 2000.
And then dissect that incredibly complicated, multi-year legal marathon. It spanned 6 years.
6 years and 3 separate trials.
Exactly. And finally, we have to devote time to the powerful legacy his parents created. They really ensured his story became a catalyst for change.
And just to set the timeline from the start, because that gap is so central to this story, Damilola Taylor was a 10-year-old Nigerian schoolboy.
Yes.
He was killed on November 27, 2000, in Peckham, in London. But it took until 2006.
All those years.
For 2 brothers, who were only 12 and 13 at the time of the incident, to finally be convicted of manslaughter. That 6-year period, it really speaks to the immense challenges of the case.
It does. And the limits of forensic science at that specific time.
To properly understand this, we have to start with Damilola himself. Just for a moment, set aside the tragedy and understand the young person whose life was so brutally cut short.
Of course.
He was Damilola Olusimi Taylor. He was born in Lagos, Nigeria on December 7, 1989.
And his family, Richard and Gloria Taylor, they were professionals. They were part of the Yoruba ethnic group. Damilola attended the Wisdom Montessori School in Lagos.
So he had a life rooted in his family and his education in Nigeria.
He did. He had 2 siblings as well, Gubemi and Tunde.
And the move to the UK in August of 2000, it wasn't just a random decision. The sources are very clear about this.
Right. It was driven by a very urgent need. It was for medical care. The family traveled to London specifically to get advanced treatment for Damilola's sister.
She suffered from epilepsy.
Yes. And I think that's such a critical piece of context. They arrive in a new country. They're already dealing with the enormous stress of a serious medical condition.
And just trying to adapt to life in London.
Exactly. Only for this unimaginable, violent act to happen just 3 months later. Damilola had just started at his new school, Oliver Goldsmith Primary in Peckham.
And the location of their new home, and of course the scene of the crime, that's also crucial. The North Peckham estate in southeast London in the year 2000.
Well, by many accounts, it was a socially challenging area. The sources describe high levels of poverty, neglect, and quite pervasive antisocial behavior.
And gang activity, which will become very relevant later on.
That whole neighborhood context is essential. It just provides a backdrop of vulnerability for a new arrival like Damilola.
So let's detail the incident itself. It was a Monday afternoon, November 27, 2000, just before 5 p.m.
4:51 p.m., to be precise.
Yeah.
Damilola was walking home. He'd been at the Peckham Library, and he was getting close to the North Peckham estate, a journey he was probably just starting to get used to.
And the attack, it took place on a street called Blake's Road. He was set upon by a group of youths.
And this is where he suffered that single catastrophic injury.
The sources are very precise. The weapon was a broken glass bottle.
And the wound it caused, a deep gash to his left thigh, that's what sealed his fate. It severed a major artery.
The sheer brutality of it and the spontaneity. I mean, a glass bottle, something just found lying around.
The severity of that one injury just cannot be overstated. Damilola, he somehow managed to stagger away from where he was attacked.
He was found in a nearby stairwell on the estate.
Yes, bleeding profusely. And despite the medical response, he was rushed to King's College Hospital. He was pronounced dead not long after he arrived.
The official cause of death was excessive blood loss, hemorrhage from that severed artery.
For a 10-year-old boy, the blood loss would have been so rapid. Survival was tragically unlikely.
And that sudden, violent end to a young life, especially one that had traveled so far seeking care, it horrified the public.
It did. And it led to immediate and intense pressure on the police to find who was responsible.
Which brings us to the most legally complex and, frankly, frustrating part of this whole case, the multi-year battle to get a conviction.
That's right. The initial failures of the system, they fueled public outrage, but they also, in a way, forced an innovation to happen.
That's a key insight. The system failed, but that failure ultimately prompted a forensic breakthrough.
It did. But we have to start with that first attempt at prosecution. That was the 2002 trial at the Old Bailey.
And 4 youths went on trial for murder, including 2 16-year-old brothers.
And the trial just collapsed. It ended with the acquittal of all 4 of them.
So why did it fail so comprehensively? And what were the specific legal hurdles that caused that first case to just fall apart?
Well, there were 2 really big issues. The first was the prosecution's reliance on a single and what turned out to be a highly problematic witness.
Right.
Their whole case really leaned heavily on the testimony of a 14-year-old girl, and the judge, he found her evidence to be unreliable.
And that's more than just a jury having doubts. That's a judicial ruling.
Exactly. The judge is essentially saying this testimony cannot be trusted. Because of that, he had to order an acquittal by direction for 2 of the 4 defendants.
And for anyone listening, an acquittal by direction means the judge stops the trial for those defendants. He tells the jury they must find them not guilty because the evidence is legally insufficient.
It's a serious move. It signals a fundamental failure in how the prosecution gathered or vetted its evidence. And once those 2 were acquitted, the whole case was just compromised.
The jury still deliberated on the other 2.
They did, but they were also found not guilty. Justice just seemed completely thwarted.
But the problems went beyond just the witnesses, didn't they? There was also this deep disagreement among the forensic experts.
Oh, absolutely. This became the dramatic centerpiece of that first trial. This is where the defense introduced what the media called the Peter Pan argument.
Explain that.
The defense called an expert witness, Alistair Wilson, who was the associate clinical director at the Royal London Hospital. He put forward a theory designed to undercut the idea of intent.
Which is crucial for a murder charge.
Crucial. Wilson argued that Damilola's fatal wounds were consistent not with a deliberate stabbing, but with him having fallen onto a broken bottle during the attack.
So the implication is that if he fell, it was a terrible accident during a fight, but maybe not murder.
Precisely. It shifts the injury from a calculated blow to an accidental consequence of a confrontation.
In the prosecution, they tried to ridicule this theory. They used that very famous phrase.
They did. They argued that for the wound to happen the way Wilson suggested, Damilola would have had to take off and fly through the air like Peter Pan. It just highlights how hard it was to reconcile the physics of the wound with the defense's theory.
And this expert's testimony was heavily criticized.
Heavily. Under cross-examination, Wilson had to admit that he had never actually examined Damilola's body.
He hadn't.
No. Or been given the full, detailed information from the pathology report. And in complete contrast, you had the pathologist, Dr. Vesna Jurovic.
Right.
And she maintained her professional opinion throughout. She said Taylor was stabbed deliberately in the left thigh, probably while he was on the ground. That fundamental difference, it just proved insurmountable for that 2002 jury.
So after the 2002 acquittals, the initial suspects were free.
Mm-hmm.
But the police, they did something unusual. They committed to keeping the investigation active.
They did. And the breakthrough, when it eventually came, it wasn't from a new witness. It was from a gamble on evolving science.
This is the most fascinating part of the story from a forensic perspective.
I agree. The justice system had failed, but the investigators kept looking for evidence that, couldn't lie. They turned to new and emerging DNA techniques.
Spearheaded by the renowned forensic scientist, Angela Gallup.
And her team, yes. They went back to the original items that were collected back in 2000, and they were hoping they could extract some viable genetic material from them.
So what were these new techniques? I mean, what specifically changed?
The breakthrough relied on something called low copy number, or LCN, DNA testing.
Okay.
In traditional DNA testing back then, you needed a pretty substantial sample, a visible blood stain, something like that. LCN testing, however, it's designed to amplify and analyze tiny quantities of DNA.
Just a few cells.
Potentially, yes, from a brief touch or a microscopic splatter. This allowed the team to look at samples that were just too small or too degraded to get a result from in the first round of tests.
It was a very controversial technology at the time, wasn't it?
It was, and it's still debated in courts. The risk of contamination is higher, the profiles can be fragmented, but in this case, it was the only option left.
And Gallup's team was successful.
They were. They identified Damilola's blood on two specific, highly incriminating items, and these items belonged to two young men who were not part of that original group of four.
And what were the items?
Damilola's blood was found on the trainers worn by a young man named Danny Preddie, and, just as significantly, on the sweatshirt cuff of his brother, Ricky Preddie.
And that is the hard, objective evidence that completely changed the direction of the case.
It's irrefutable. It physically connected the Preddie brothers to Damilola during the fatal incident, and it provided the solid foundation they needed to overcome all those earlier problems.
So this led to fresh arrests in 2005. But this time, the charges were manslaughter, not murder. Why the change?
Well, that was a very strategic legal move by the prosecution. To prove murder, you have to prove intent, the intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm.
Which was the whole sticking point in the first trial.
Exactly. Given that whole debate about whether he was stabbed or fell, and the difficulty of proving a 12-year-old intended to kill someone, manslaughter was a much more achievable charge.
It just requires proving a criminal act resulted in death.
Right. It removes that high bar of premeditation. So the new defendants were Hassan Jihad, who was 19, and the Preddie brothers, Danny and Ricky, who were 16 and 17 by then.
Which brings us to the second trial in 2006.
Yes, another long process, starting in January at the Old Bailey. And even with the new DNA evidence, the defense structure was similar. Alistair Wilson, the expert with the falling theory, he testified again.
He still maintained his original stance.
He did. They continued to argue that the wound was sustained accidentally, even if the boys were involved in an assault.
And the result of that second trial was, again, more frustration for the family.
It was a fragmented verdict. The jury acquitted Hassan Jihad of all charges. They cleared him completely.
Okay.
However, they couldn't reach a verdict on the manslaughter charges against the two Preddie brothers.
A hung jury.
A hung jury, which meant the brothers were released, but the prosecution immediately said they would seek a retrial, which is a rare and very determined move.
So after almost 6 years, the family was forced into a third legal battle. The retrial began in June 2006.
And at this point, the Preddie brothers were over 18, so their anonymity was lifted. They could be publicly named Ricky Gavin Preddie and Danny Charles Preddie.
And during this retrial, more context about them came out.
It did. The sources confirmed that both brothers were already known to police, they'd committed multiple robberies, and they had been members of the local Peckham Boys street gang since 1997.
This profile, it supported the prosecution's narrative, didn't it?
It made the circumstances of the attack more plausible to the jury. It painted a picture of a pattern of violent, antisocial behavior.
And finally, after all that time, the long search for a resolution came to an end.
On August 9, 2006, after a 33-day retrial, the verdict came in. Ricky and Danny Preddie were convicted of Damilola Taylor's manslaughter.
A victory for the investigators and a painful partial resolution for the family.
Yes, and it's worth noting something else that came out in that retrial. The sources mention lapses in the initial prosecution process.
Right.
And while we don't have the specific details, the fact it was noted at all is a crucial insight. It suggests the failures weren't just about an unreliable witness. It points to flaws in how the initial case was presented, which prolonged this whole process by years.
So the eventual success really relied on science overcoming those earlier human errors.
It absolutely did.
So with the conviction finally secured, the focus, as it always does, shifted to the sentencing.
And this was delivered by Mr. Justice Goldring on October 9, 2006. He sentenced both of the Preddie brothers to 8 years in youth custody for manslaughter.
And he provided a detailed explanation for that sentence, which is really important to understand.
It is. The sources emphasize that the relatively short sentence was a direct result of the law governing youth crime. The judge stressed the primary factor was the age of the offenders.
12 and 13 years old.
Exactly. The sentencing guidelines have to reflect the lower culpability and, the greater potential for rehabilitation for juveniles compared to adults.
He also pointed out there was no evidence of premeditation.
Right. And this was crucial. He emphasized that the glass bottle wasn't carried to the scene as a weapon. It was a weapon of opportunity.
Spontaneous violence that just escalated tragically.
That distinction is what kept the charge at manslaughter and the sentence within those youth custody limits.
It's completely understandable, though, that Damilola's parents, Richard and Gloria Taylor, were publicly very unhappy with that 8-year sentence.
Of course. For a grieving family, any sentence can feel insufficient compared to the life that was stolen.
It's that gap between legal justice and what feels like emotional justice.
It is. Now, to understand the perpetrators, we should look at their background a little. They were born in Peckham. Their father, Alfred Preddie, was a boxer from Jamaica who died in 2004.
And their mother was Marion Johnson.
Yes. And as we noted, their involvement with the Peckham Boys gang began in 1997 when they were extremely young. The sources describe them as street children, fearless and brutal.
It really illustrates a deep-rooted social problem that existed long before Damilola was killed.
And unfortunately, the subsequent criminal history of one of the brothers, Ricky Preddie, suggests a significant failure of the system to rehabilitate him.
His record after his release is quite expensive.
It is. He was first released on parole in September 2010, so he served 4 years of his 8-year sentence.
But he wasn't out for long.
No. Just 6 months later, in March 2011, he was recalled to prison for breaking his parole terms. He was released again in February 2012. You see a cycle starting to form.
And his later crimes were quite severe.
Very. The most recent incident in the sources is from February 2020. Ricky Preddie, who was sometimes using his mother's surname, Johnson, was jailed for another 4 years.
And this was for what?
For driving his car directly into a police officer. The attack left the female officer with serious injuries.
So he pleaded guilty to causing serious injury by dangerous driving whilst disqualified, failing to stop.
All of it. The fact that years after his sentence for manslaughter, he was still engaging in this kind of aggressive, dangerous behavior, it really illustrates a deep systemic failure.
It highlights the challenge of ensuring youth custody doesn't just punish, but actually reforms individuals who are so entrenched in that kind of life from such a young age.
It does, and it's why the tragedy of Damilola Taylor remains so linked to the ongoing conversation about youth violence and rehabilitation in the UK.
And while the cycle of crime for the perpetrators continued, Damilola's family, Richard and Gloria Taylor, did something truly remarkable. They transformed their grief into a powerful movement for social good.
This transition from victim to advocate is perhaps the most enduring part of Damilola's entire story.
And they started very quickly. In May 2001, while that first disastrous trial was still underway, they established the Damilola Taylor Trust.
It wasn't just symbolic. The trust had a very clear mission. It was about campaigning specifically against knife crime and dedicating resources to improve the lives of disadvantaged children.
They recognized that their son's death was a symptom of a wider social crisis.
It was. And then, so tragically, in April 2008, Gloria Taylor died from a heart attack. This was just 2 years after the final conviction.
Compounding the family's loss.
It left Richard Taylor to carry that mission forward on his own, which he did with incredible dedication.
He really elevated his personal campaign to a national platform. He dedicated the rest of his life to it. His efforts gained huge momentum in 2008 when he organized a march against knife crime in central London.
That march was a pivotal moment. Thousands of young people attended. It showed a real desire for change from within the communities that were most affected.
And he led that march with Brick Kinsella, whose brother Ben had also been stabbed to death.
Right. That unified effort was so powerful. It brought victims' families together and just underscored the systemic nature of the violence they were all fighting against.
And his commitment was recognized by the government. In 2009, Prime Minister Gordon Brown appointed him as an anti-knife crime and youth violence envoy.
And that wasn't just a ceremonial role. It gave him a direct line to national policy discussions. It allowed the lived experience of his family's tragedy to actually influence government strategy.
It was a powerful platform.
It was. And in recognition of all his work, he was awarded an OBE in the 2011 New Year Honors. He continued this advocacy, fighting for Damilola's legacy and for vulnerable children, right up until his death from prostate cancer on March 23, 2024.
His life became a monumental example of resilience and purpose in the face of just unspeakable loss.
It really did.
And the impact of Damilola's story went beyond policy and charity. It filtered very deeply into British arts and media.
You see this very clearly in literature. The children's author Beverly Naidu was so moved when she heard the news.
Her book, The Other Side of Truth, was about Nigerian child refugees.
Exactly. It was already successful. So she organized an ongoing donation of 10 pence from the sale of every single copy of that book to the Refugee Council, a very direct, tangible link.
And then there's Stephen Kellman's 2011 novel, Pigeon English.
Yes, a highly acclaimed debut. It was nominated for the Man Booker Prize. And the sources confirm it drew direct inspiration from the atmosphere surrounding Damilola's killing.
But maybe the most intimate connection is with the actor John Boyega.
Right. Famed for his role in Star Wars, but he grew up in Peckham. He was only 8 years old at the time.
And both he and his older sister Grace They were friends with Damilola.
The sources poignantly note they were among the last people to see Damilola alive. It just brings the tragedy right down to that personal neighborhood level.
And the media, of course, ensured the story was never forgotten. The BBC's Panorama covered it back in 2002.
And then years later, in 2016, the BBC aired the dramatization, Damilola, Our Loved Boy. It was a really powerful, emotional account of the whole story.
And it won a BAFTA award for single drama.
It did. And more recently, for the 20th anniversary in 2020, Channel 4 aired a documentary called Damilola, The Boy Next Door.
And that was hosted by another of his childhood friends, Yinka Bokini.
Yes. And having a friend host, it just provided such a raw firsthand perspective on the lasting trauma. It moved beyond the legal facts into the emotional reality of what that community went through.
And finally, the legacy has been institutionalized, hasn't it?
It has. In 2020, December 7th, which is Damilola's birthday, was officially declared the Day of Hope. It ensures the focus remains on the positive outcomes his parents fought for: charity, mentorship, safer communities. It makes sure his life is remembered as a call to action.
So what we've really examined today is this devastating portrait of loss. But it's also a story defined by a persistent, agonizing fight for legal resolution.
We've seen the senseless end of a young life, the necessity of 3 separate trials, and the complete dependence on that cutting edge and very controversial forensic science.
The LCN DNA testing.
Yes, that was what it took to finally secure a conviction. And crucially, we've analyzed the incredible dignity and purpose found by Richard and Gloria Taylor, who turned their personal catastrophe into a national movement for change.
The central lesson here really seems to be the triumph of forensic persistence over that initial systemic failure.
I think so. That initial acquittal in 2002 could have just buried the case forever. But the decision to keep the investigation open and the application of that new DNA technology,
That was the linchpin.
it was the absolute linchpin. Finding that trace of blood on the Preddie brothers' clothing was the objective proof they needed. It allowed them to bypass all the disputed expert testimony and successfully pivot the charge from murder to manslaughter.
For you, the listener, understanding this case means recognizing the fragility of justice when it relies on human witnesses.
And the power of hard scientific fact to eventually prevail.
It is a profound story that continues to resonate today.
It is, and the legacy of Damilola Taylor is very much a living one. The Damilola Taylor Trust continues its work. The Day of Hope ensures his purpose remains visible. So the final thought to consider is this. Decades later, as urban youth violence persists, how can we as a society ensure that the resources and the political will that were dedicated to solving this one case are consistently applied to the preventative work that Richard and Gloria Taylor championed, honoring their sacrifice by protecting the next generation?
Thank you for joining us for this serious and important examination of the sources related to the killing of Damilola Taylor.
Thanks for listening.